Many people today claim that the Constitution is a racist document or a mere compromise. Some people say it really had no meaning at all because it was simply based on compromise. What people don't want to understand about that is that the Constitution was based on the Declaration of Independence, which is clearly a pro-human liberty document. And what the Constitution does is to take the real situation of Americans, which was a situation where there were still many slaves in the country, including some places where they were the majority of the population. Bring those states into the Union, where they can then join with the other states that have fewer slaves and are on the cusp of abolishing slavery, and be influenced by them in a constitutional union.
Hello, my name is Portia, and I'm a sophomore majoring in economics at Hillsdale College. This is part of a 10-week course, Constitution 101, presented by Hillsdale College. Today you will be hearing from Dr. Will Morrissey, the William and Patricia Lamothe Chair in the U.S. Constitution and Associate Professor of Politics, on the crisis of constitutional government. Please watch.
Abraham Lincoln famously called America's crisis of constitutional government the crisis of the house divided. He takes this phrase from the book of Matthew, chapter 12, verse 25. You'll recall that Jesus had healed a demon-possessed man. For this act of kindness, the Pharisees accused him of casting out demons by the authority of Beelzebub, the ruler of the demons. Now, Lincoln takes this passage, he selects this passage of the many quotes you could take from the Bible. It's a very characteristic Lincoln move, and it's a very characteristic American citizen move. Jesus is not commanding anyone here. He's not laying down the law. What he's about to do is to make an argument, to persuade his audience of something. This is citizen. He's speaking as a citizen to other citizens in this passage. Jesus replies, any kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and any city or house divided against itself shall not stand. This being so, he argues, Satan would not be so foolish as to cast out Satan, that is to say, to cast out Satan's demons. No ruler will intentionally weaken his own house, his own kingdom. Why would Satan grant such power to me, his argument is, if I would use it to undermine his empire? But on the contrary, he says, if I cast out demons by the Spirit of God, then the kingdom of God has come upon you. This is not the rulership of Satan, this is the rulership of God. That is, if I'm not satanic, by what authority do I cast out demons except by the authority of God? For human beings alone are no match for demons. What has any of this to do with America, a country that, while good, cannot be confused with the kingdom of God? To understand what Lincoln has in mind, we need to see that he understands the crisis of American constitutional government as both a moral and a political crisis. Further, he understands the political crisis both as a crisis of the American regime, that is to say, a crisis of American republicanism, and also as a crisis of the American state, that is, a crisis of American federalism. Third, he understands the moral and political crises as fundamentally identical, because both entail a crisis of self-government under God. Finally, he understands this crisis exactly the way Jesus leads the Pharisees to understand the crisis of ruling authority that they address, namely as a crisis of faction, the very question that, as you've seen in earlier lectures, Madison addresses in the 10th Federalist. Now, consider the moral and political circumstances of Lincoln's time, the crisis that he addresses. When he was 10 years old, the House of Representatives had passed legislation to admit the territory of Missouri into the Union under conditions that would have gradually emancipated the slaves there. The Senate blocked that bill. The compromise legislation, the famous Missouri Compromise of 1820, consisted of two bills. They passed both houses the following year, in 1820. Congress admitted Maine as a free state. It enabled the Missourians to have a state constitution that allowed slavery. Congress also banned slavery from the remaining federally owned Louisiana Purchase territory north of the 30 line. This meant that 9 future states would be free of slaves, and only 2, the future Arkansas and Oklahoma, would be open to slaveholding. The great purchaser of the Louisiana territory was Thomas Jefferson. In 1820, Thomas Jefferson was still alive. And what he and the Compromise of 1820 alarmed Thomas Jefferson. He likened it to a fire bell in the night which awakened me and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union, the death knell, in other words, of the Union. It is hushed indeed for the moment, but this is a reprieve only, not a final sentence. A geographical line, this 3630 line, coinciding with a marked principle, moral and political, namely slave states on one side, free states on the other, once conceived and held up to the angry passions of men, will never be obliterated. And every new irritation will mark it deeper and deeper. Jefferson had pinned his hopes for continued American Union even after that massive geographical extension that he had effected with the Louisiana Purchase. He'd pinned his hopes on a continued union on the practice of diffusing slavery through, and thereby diluting its core in the Deep South where it was most prevalent. If the slave populations of the South could be reduced as a percentage of the overall population in those states, then slavery might gradually and peacefully be abolished there, just as it had been placed on the road to extinction in the northern states, where slaves had never amounted to anything close to a majority of the population. The Missouri Compromise, in his view, wrecked this possibility, and he expected the American confederal state to sunder as a result, as it very nearly did. Although the questions of tariffs and the national bank also threatened the Union in the years following the compromise, slavery remained near or at the surface of the national debate. The young Lincoln saw this and he heard it. On the moral level, Lincoln's opposition to slavery was principled and consistent. He built opposition to slavery into his very definition of the American regime, into his very definition of what democracy is. As I would not be a slave, he said, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea of democracy. On a steamboat ride from Louisville to St. Louis in 1841, as a very young man, he saw slaves chained together with irons, a sight that remained, as he put it, a continual torment to me. He wrote to a slave-owning friend asking him to appreciate how much the great body of northern people do crucify their feelings in order to maintain their loyalty to the Constitution and to the Union. The pro-slavery morality that developed in the South after the Missouri Compromise, just as Jefferson had predicted, finds no support in the Bible, Lincoln contended. The Bible, he said, commands men to give to the needy. The rule of slavery is take from the needy. Admittedly, the Bible countenances slavery, he says, but that slavery was the slavery of the white man, that is to say, of white men over other white men. To justify slavery in America proves rather too much for the comfort of white supremacists, any of whom might find himself enslaved in light of Old Testament law. Nor does slavery find any support in logic. If slavery is good, why does no man ever seek it for himself? If skin color distinguishes man from man with respect to eligibility for slavery, one is by right, Lincoln says, the slave of the first man you meet with a fairer skin than your own. And if intellectual gradations are the relevant measures, if whites deserve to rule blacks without blacks' consent because whites are very much more intelligent than blacks are, then, again quoting Lincoln, you are to be the slave to the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. Some of us might not have to wait very long for that. Does that not present a problem for most of us? In principle, really a problem for all but one of us. A nation of 300 million that would logically be ruled by the smartest one, which means that the logic of slavery logically entails what? Tyranny. The tyranny of the smartest one. The moral argument on slavery and self-government that Lincoln had most immediately to oppose in the years before the Civil War was not the Southerners' argument that slavery was a positive good, but the more subtle argument of his Illinois political rival, Senator Stephen A. Douglas. Douglas maintained that self-government means, quote, the great principle that every people ought to possess the right to form and regulate their own domestic institutions in their own way. A prospective state, a territory, ought to be able to vote slavery up or down. Self-government so conceived means that, quote, every community may judge and decide for itself whether a thing is right or wrong, whether it would be good or evil for them to adopt it. Such self-government, Douglas maintained, is the birthright of free men and rests upon the right of free action, the right of free thought, the right of free judgment. Slavery is no exception to this unqualified right to choose. You must allow the people to decide for themselves whether it is a good or an evil, Douglas insisted, just as they decide on liquor laws, banking laws, and school budgets. To say otherwise is to betray the fundamental right the American revolutionaries fought for, the right, as Douglas puts it, to pass laws concerning our property and domestic and private institutions by our own consent. Lincoln replied that moral principles don't stop at state boundaries. If slavery is wrong in principle, it's wrong in principle everywhere, even if it must be tolerated in some places for reasons of practical necessity. A community should have slaves if it wants them, only if slavery is not a wrong, Lincoln said. But, he continues, if it is a wrong, Douglas cannot say that a people have a right to do wrong. You cannot institute any equality between right and wrong. Lincoln called Douglas the most dangerous enemy of liberty because the most insidious one, and he meant it. Douglas, he said, never lets the logic of principle displace the logic of success. His race-baiting arguments for the right to choose slavery or freedom, slavery for others, without their consent, were corrupting the public opinion upon which government by consent depends. Before the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which repealed the Missouri Compromise by opening Kansas to an up or down vote on the admission of slaveholding, and that was Douglas's bill that he introduced. Lincoln says, I believe before that it is safe to assert that no living man had expressed the opinion that the Negro had no share in the Declaration of Independence. Of course, the great South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun had done so earlier, but he died in 1850, a few years before. 3 short years after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the 1857 Dred Scott case had the Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney asserting that the American founders believed that blacks, as such, slaves or free men, quote, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his own benefit, and that the Declaration's crystalline words, all men are created equal, only, as Tawney puts it, only seem to embrace the whole human family. They only seem to. By 1859, Lincoln remarked, the whole Democratic Party was saying that. Quote, the tendency of that change, is to bring the public mind to the conclusion that when men are spoken of, the Negro is not meant. And when Negroes are spoken of, brutes alone are contemplated. This is a falsehood, as anyone even superficially familiar with the writings of all the principal founders would know. It's also the top of a slippery slope. Quote, our progress in degeneracy appears to me to be pretty rapid. As a nation, we began by declaring all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. When the know-nothings get control, and by the know-nothings he means the American Party, which was a significant third-party nationalist movement in the United States in those days, when they get control, it will read all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When it comes to this, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they take no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy. Indeed, in claiming that the Declaration of Independence refers only to British American subjects, Douglass had unwittingly left out not only blacks, but Germans, French, Dutch Americans, all non-British whites, then in the colonies, right? To educate citizens to, quote, care not whether slavery be voted up or down, which is exactly what Douglass said, by the settlers of the territories. Douglass made, and these are Lincoln's words, liberty and slavery perfectly consistent. He's squared the circle. He's made the illogical look logical. To argue that is to argue, Lincoln says, for a strong man to declare himself the superior of a weak one, and thereupon enslave the weak one, is the very essence of liberty, the most sacred right of self-government. The man who starts out by arguing for self-government in the territories ends in justifying tyranny in the territories. In arguing that might is right, Lincoln says, is blowing out the moral lights around us. In calling liberty and slavery compatible, in calling the right to institute slavery compatible with self-government, Douglass is, in my judgment, penetrating the human soul and eradicating the light of reason and the love of liberty in this American people. If might is right, where does that leave liberty? Douglass spoke not for consent, but for majority tyranny, and indeed not even for majority tyranny in regard to those states where slaves actually formed the majority of the population. He appealed precisely to the misconception of liberty that so many people make, the belief that liberty means doing as I like. It's the principle of non-contradiction, which is the principle of reason itself, the principle by which human beings must be ruled if they are to govern themselves, that's finally the reason why a house divided against itself cannot stand. In Matthew 12, the house divided can't stand because Satan's demons cannot be expelled with Satan's aid unless Satan is willing to undermine his own might, his own empire. In countenancing slavery on the level of moral principle, Douglass unwittingly committed himself to a deal with the Satan, with the enemy of self-government. The very apostle Satan is of the principle might is right. There may be equality among men, but there cannot be equality between right and wrong for men. And if there cannot be equality between right and wrong for men, must all men not be treated as men? That is, equally in those things in which they are equal, namely their rights. Now, there's a further moral complication to this clear line of reasoning. When you're engaging in moral reasoning, it's one thing, it's crucial to establish the basic principle that you're dealing with, to establish it clearly, to make sure that nobody muddies the waters the way the slaveholders like Calhoun and the popular sovereignty people like Douglas were doing. That's one thing you need to do. But the other thing you need to do is that you have a practical situation, wherever you are, whatever you're doing. You need to persuade people to line up as closely as possible with that moral standard, that moral principle. It's not enough just to assert the principle, because, let's face it, in practical life, we can't simply embody the principles that we espouse. There are always going to be limitations to what we do. Here's the way Lincoln deals with this, and he deals with this in a famous passage in his debate with Douglas, his 1858 Senate debate with Douglas. Lincoln has often been charged regarding that debate with racial prejudice on the grounds of statements that he made during those debates in Illinois. But it's more accurate to say that Lincoln was not a racist at all. What he was a race pessimist. Quite different. A close look at the transcript of his Senate debate comments shows this. Lincoln assured the crowd at the debates with Douglas, crowds that really were virulently prejudiced and whose prejudices Senator Douglas fired up over and over as he struck at Lincoln and the black Republicans, as he called them. Lincoln assured the crowds that he had no intention, to put it in his words, to introduce political and social equality between the black and white races. But listen to carefully the way he puts it. I agree with Judge Douglas that the black man is not my equal in many respects. Certainly not in color. Certainly not in color. Perhaps not in moral or intellectual endowment, but in the right to eat the bread without the leave, that is, the permission of anybody else, which his own hand earns. He, the black man, is my equal, the equal of Judge Douglas, and the equal of every living man. What has he just done here? He has stood up in front of a large crowd of bigoted whites, and he's managed to whittle down the certain inequalities concerning blacks and whites to exactly one, which is skin color. The claim of race prejudice on its certain grounds is literally skin deep. And he maintained his opposition to Douglas on the one big issue that was actually on the table. Social and political equality with whites was not on the table in 1858 by a long shot. It was starting to get on the table in 1958, when I was a child. In 1858, the actual issue was extending slavery into the territories. So he's upheld the principle, he's defended the principle of the right of a person, no matter what his skin color, to eat the bread that he has earned by his own work, which is a basic principle of natural right. He's upheld that, and he's upheld it in a way that his audience, the people who must consent in order for Abraham Lincoln to win the election, in a way that they can accept. And it moves them a little bit away from those virulent prejudices that Douglas is fanning. That one certain difference between the races, skin color, seemed enough to spark permanent animosity between the races. Lincoln said, a universal feeling, whether well or ill-founded, cannot be safely disregarded. This is government by consent. You're going to have to work around prejudices with large audiences, in a mass democracy, in a republic. You're going to have to work around those things, but at the same time, push the opinion in a slightly different direction. He says the physical difference between the two races, the physical difference, you notice, not moral. And here is Lincoln's pessimism. This physical difference will probably forever forbid their living together upon the footing of perfect equality. That being so, I, as well as Judge Douglas, am in favor of the race to which I belong having the superior position. Well, I should say, so to claim otherwise would be to invite charges of hypocrisy at very best, right? But here, too, Lincoln rejected the condition of such superiority. Instead, he advocated racial separation. The separation would not involve segregation or apartheid within American society, the separate but equal doctrine that would be set down in that infamous Plessy versus Ferguson case a couple of decades later. For most of his career, Lincoln advocated colonization of American blacks, as Jefferson, John Marshall, and many others had done, and as Marcus Garvey would do decades later. Segregation with nationhood for African Americans would mean self-government for them. It would remove, Lincoln believed, it would also remove a serious obstacle to peaceful self-government for American whites. He argued to a delegation of African Americans that the hardship of colonization would be less arduous than the hardships faced by Washington and his troops during the Revolutionary War. Would this generation of American blacks not aspire to be founders? Lincoln implied. As we know now, such colonization was not practical on a mass scale, and the question of race it has remained. It's been a stubborn force ever since. Lincoln's pessimism was to some degree justified. It's improved greatly. The situation has improved even in my lifetime. But the argument that he's making is not a race superiority argument by any stretch. Now that's the moral dimension of the crisis of American constitutionalism, the practical dimension of it and the principled dimension of it, both, and he coordinates the two. But what of its closely related political dimension, or rather its two dimensions, namely the crisis of the American regime and the crisis of the American state, the crisis of the American federal union? The crisis of the American regime, the crisis of republicanism, was the threat to the maintenance of republicanism, or popular self-government, via freely elected representatives of the sovereign people. The crisis of the American state was the crisis of federalism, sometimes called the crisis of state rights. The constitutional nexus of republicanism and federalism, where they come together, is in Article 4, Section 4 of the American Constitution. Quote, "The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government, and shall protect each of them against invasion, and on application of the state legislature, or of the executive, meaning the governor of the state, when the legislature cannot be convened, against domestic violence." Close quote. Here is where the framers speak to the heart of their intentions for America. What danger did this clause address? The highly respected Massachusetts delegate, Nathaniel Gorham, joined John Randolph and George Mason of Virginia, James Wilson of Pennsylvania, in issuing the warning, without this federal power, quote, "an enterprising citizen might erect the standard of monarchy in a particular state, might gather together partisans from all quarters, might extend his views from state to state, and threaten to establish a tyranny over the whole, that is, the whole Union, and the general government be compelled, if you didn't have this power, be compelled to remain an inactive witness of its own destruction." Close quote. That is, the framers anticipated the kind of career undertaken by Napoleon in France just a decade after the Constitution was written. And they moved decisively and effectively to prevent that from happening here. As usual, James Madison, writing in the 43rd Federalist, provides the clearest overview. In a confederacy founded on Republican principles and composed of Republican members, that is to say, each state, the superintending government, the federal government, ought clearly to possess authority to defend the system against aristocratic or monarchical innovations. Why so? Because the United States is not only a republic, but it's also a federal union. Again, Madison, the more intimate the nature of the union may be, the greater interest have the members in the political institutions of each other, and the greater right to insist that the forms of government under which the compact was entered into should be substantially maintained. What is more, Madison continues, governments of dissimilar principles and forms have been found less adapted to the federal coalition than any other sort, than those of a kindred nature are so adapted. In other words, you need similar regime principles to have an effective federal union. And the evidence he cites is from Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, the massive evidence that Montesquieu adduces in that book. Not only the federal government, but the constituent states of the federal union must be Republican. A fully Republican union alone can stand as what Jefferson called an empire for liberty. But, Madison says, but a right implies a remedy. What power within the United States can safely prevent an anti-Republican faction from seizing control of a state? Quote, what better umpires could be desired by two violent factions, say an aristocratic faction and a Republican faction, flying to arms and tearing a state to pieces, than the representatives of Confederate states not heated by the local flame? To the impartiality of judges, they would unite the affection of friends. Close quote. Even more ambitiously, Madison continues, happy would it be if such a remedy for its infirmities could be enjoyed by all free governments, if a project equally effectual could be established for the universal peace of all mankind. This would require that Republican regimes achieve today what we would call a critical mass, right? Throughout the world. In 1787, Republicanism had achieved critical mass only in the U.S. If Republicanism failed here, when and where would it revive? When and where would a general civil peace obtain? The condition for securing unalienable natural rights. Protection against invasion includes not only invasions by foreigners. The United States, after all, was bordered by the non-Republican empires of Spain and Great Britain in those days, as well as by the non-Republican and still formidable Amerindian nations to the west, but also by other states of the Union. This is something that is not necessarily understood clearly because it's kind of under the table. Although, as Montesquieu had remarked, commercial Republican regimes had never fought one another in the past, the framers were taking no chances. In his Federalist essay, Madison did not hesitate to notice a force that might intervene in any disorder, whether anti-Republican or Republican, foreign, interstate, or intra-state. And this is his quote, an unhappy species of population abounds in some states, slaves of course, who during the calm of regular government are sunk below the level of men in their social status, but who in the tempestuous scenes of civil violence may emerge into the human character. In other words, they may man up for the occasion. right, seeing their opportunity, and give a superiority of strength to any party with which they may associate themselves. In other words, the slaves could tip the balance between a Republican faction and a monarchic or aristocratic faction in an intra-state or interstate civil war. The presence of slaves in the United States raised the harshest questions about both the American regime and the American Federal Union. By nature, the slaves were men. By law, they were a self-contradictory mixture of personhood and of property. Civil disorder of any kind might induce them to rise up and claim their natural rights, perhaps at the expense of the natural rights of their masters. Slave revolts had occurred already in New York during the colonial period. And, of course, the freeman Toussaint Louverture had led a temporarily successful insurrection of slaves in Haiti beginning in 1791. Quote from Madison, "We have seen the mere distinction of color," same kind of language Lincoln used, right? The mere distinction of color in the most enlightened period of time, we, the 18th century, right? A ground of the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man. That's Madison. Madison and the other founders sought some way to avoid such a revolt, which might overturn republicanism in the name of republicanism, or perhaps install some other regime as a remedy to the evils of slaveholding republicanism. Put in a slightly different way, the dilemma was as simple as it was stark. As Madison wrote in Federalist 43, the Republican Guarantee Clause, that section, Article 4, Section 4 clause, supposes a pre-existing government of the form of which is to be guaranteed. That is, the basis of the federal union, the American Confederacy, right? The new empire of liberty replacing the old empire of tyranny. The basis of that is Republican regime in each constituent state. Each state entered the Union acknowledged as a republic by all the others. But how Republican were those states in which slaves abounded? Madison knew the answer, which he would write down in an unpublished note a few years later. He didn't make this one public. Quote, "In proportion as slavery prevails in a state, the government, however democratic in name, must be aristocratic in fact. The power lies in the part instead of the whole, in property instead of numbers. All the ancient republics were, for this reason, aristocracies," he says. "The majority were slaves." He continues, "The southern states of America are on the same principle aristocracies." That means his own state of Virginia, and he says this in this note, the population of non-freeholding whites and black slaves amounted to 3/4 of the population. If you combine the non-landowning whites with the slaves, that's 75% of the population. As he wrote in his 1787 critique of the Articles of Confederation, and this is published, he titles this "The Vices of the Political System of the United States." He went so far as to publish a sentence in that essay that said this: "Where slavery exists, the Republican principle becomes still more fallacious than it does under conditions wherein the large number of disenfranchised paupers, for example, exists as in the European states at that time. It's more fallacious there than it is in some of the states of Europe." All of this being so, the Republican regime and the Republican Union, the unity of the United States, began their life on a knife edge. The framers hoped that the new Constitution would provide a framework for the peaceful resolution of the problem. Lincoln enumerates the steps they took in his Cooper Union address, But the Southern slaveholding aristocracy had other ideas. Historian Robert Bonner has shown that the second generation of Southern statesmen initially centered their political strategy on defending their regimes by means of the federal union established by the founders. Senator Calhoun epitomized these statesmen. So long as the structure of the Union provided a protective shield for slaveholders from foreign regimes that discountenanced slavery, Great Britain in particular, Calhoun upheld nationalism, playing the war hawk during the 1812 crisis, for example. In this, he followed his fellow South Carolinian, Charles Pinckney, who had told the state's ratifying convention back in 1788 that only a Quixote, a Don Quixote, would suppose that a state with a dense slave population could, quote, long maintain her independence if she stood alone or was only connected with other southern states. So they needed the Union then, and they needed it to defend their slaveholding. But by the late 1820s, as the slave states prospered within the Union, Calhoun could begin thinking of just such independence. As is well known, by the end of his life, he could set the price of continuation of the federal union at the level of his concurrent majority doctrine, which meant that you'd have a dual presidency, one guy from the North, one guy from the South, all those kinds of things. Throughout the 1850s, both Southern secessionists and Southern Unionists disagreed not over slavery, but over which policy better defended slavery. There were Unionists in the South. They were still holding that old Pinckney position. That was the debate. By 1861, the Confederate States of America president and Calhoun protege, Jefferson Davis, lamented what he called the evil hour in which some of our most distinguished Southern statesmen, Jefferson, Madison, admitted that slavery was an evil, an admission that took from us all ground save that of present necessity. The sort of argument Thomas Jefferson made when he said that we slaveholders have the wolf by the ears and we don't dare let him go. On the contrary, Davis, Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, and their fellow secessionists contended slavery formed the indispensable foundation for their new regime. This is why in 1854 in Jackson, Michigan, in response to the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, anti-slavery Unionists named their new party the Republican Party, precisely in order, as they put it, to battle for the first principles of Republican government and against the schemes of aristocracy, the most revolting and oppressive of which the earth was ever cursed. To establish and maintain the moral and political good of a Republican federal union founded upon the principle of equal rights, a regime and a state without which no American rights could be secured. The founders had tolerated the wrong of slavery, given what Lincoln called the necessity springing from the actual presence of slavery at the time of the founding. Without the compromises regarding slavery in 1787, the Constitution wouldn't have been ratified in the first place. At the same time, Lincoln maintains, given the fact that, as he puts it, no policy that does not rest upon some philosophic public opinion can be permanently maintained, in the end, Americans must decide whether they believe that slavery is morally right and socially elevating, the principle of aristocracy, or morally wrong and socially degrading, the principle of republicanism, the principle of democracy as Lincoln himself defined it. In the end, Americans decided against slavery and aristocracy, for natural rights and republicanism, but only at the cost of the crisis of American constitutionalism that ended in civil war, which was the crisis of the House divided.